So thanks everyone for joining. This session is Transforming My Pedagogy Peer Learning Communities in Online Courses by Erik Oleson at University of Colorado, Denver. And I'll hand it over to you, Erik.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. Today, I'm going to share some of the changes I've made to my asynchronous online courses that made them more thought-provoking, inclusive, and equitable. So, I'm really more of an NIH-funded neuroscientist. I was primarily hired for research purposes, and I typically present on basic STEM research. However, I've recently become very interested in improving my craft as a teacher and even devoted my last sabbatical to researching inclusive pedagogy in collaboration with the Center of Teaching and Learning at Bates College. So today, I'll first tell you about my transition from becoming a scientist who only cared about his own neuroscience research and passing down his own knowledge through sort of me-centric lectures to being a student-centric teacher who facilitates the learning process in a manner that is inclusive of all perspectives and elevates all student voices. I will then share with you some specific learning activities I'm using in my current classes. The first learning activity can be generally described as deep thinking discussions. These discussions are designed to be thought-provoking and even welcome constructive criticism of my lecture content and source material. They also enact inclusive pedagogy because each student is given agency to think and communicate. After providing several examples of the different strategies I used through which I foster these deep thinking discussions, I'll describe a distinct peer learning community approach I'm using in my drugs, brain, and behavior course. In this unique assignment, students join a music, book, or movie club, similarly to what we were playing with in our icebreaker, where they collaboratively consider drugs from a unique perspective. The primary objective of this seminar is to promote low stakes, engaging, and thought provoking learning activities as an innovative solution that promotes equity in online asynchronous learning environments. So currently, I'm a professor at a regional R1 liberal arts campus that primarily serves first generation students. The University of Colorado, Denver is also a Hispanic serving and Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institution. Over the last several years, including summers, I've been teaching about 7 to 8 asynchronous online undergraduate courses per year. My classes tend to be very high enrolling, and I typically raise the capacity by about 50% each time. The cap is typically around 30. Right now, I'm teaching 3 classes, each of which has about 50 to 60 students in them. One reason my courses are in demand is because they are engaging, inclusive, and accommodate a wide array of student needs. This semester, I'm teaching 3 upper division classes: drugs, brain, and behavior, hormones and behavior, and behavioral neuroscience. And I'll share some specific examples from each describing some of the inclusive and effective teaching practices I've adopted. But before I get into these specific examples, I would like to acknowledge that things weren't always this way. And I think that this is important because I think this is very common for sort of, you know, professors, sort of like I am and have been, that tend to be very research focused and, certain disciplines I think this is particularly common in. But anyway, let me just talk about myself here. When I became a professor, I think it's fair to say I was not exactly good at the teaching part of my job. Not only did I view teaching as a secondary chore to my neuroscience research, I was neither an inclusive nor an effective teacher. For example, there were clear race-based and first-generation equity gaps in my drop withdrawal failing rates. And I'll show you the receipts. I'll show you the data here in a minute. When I became a professor, I really had no idea how to be an effective teacher. And I didn't really care to learn. I was obsessed with establishing my neuroscience research lab, winning grants, publishing articles in high impact journals, and giving presentations about my research around the world. I had never taught nor TA'd an undergraduate class because I did all of my graduate and postgraduate training at major R1 medical schools and was financially supported by research assistantships and training grants. My advisors wanted me to collect data, not teach. In fact, they basically forbid it. So without training, but with significant hubris, I started my secondary job as a teacher when I became hired as a faculty member. I was a sage on the stage who wanted students to memorize every esoteric detail in my mind. I focused solely on my knowledge of mechanisms, nomenclature, and anatomy, rather than real-world applications or the students' ideas or experiences. I would speed through 120 PowerPoint slides in 90 minutes and give 3 high-stakes exams per year that solely determine the students' final grades. The student observers only had a voice if there was time for questions, and there never was. Usually, I ran overtime with my lectures, and I was generally inflexible, rigid, and held a weed out mindset. And here I'll just ask for some internal reflection. Does this resonate with anyone? Maybe you weren't as rigid, or maybe your professor wasn't as rigid and interested in weeding out students as I was, but perhaps you encountered professors like me in your academic journey and can attest to the impact that this mindset had on creating imposter syndrome or discouraging minoritized populations from pursuing higher level goals in your field. So there's no need to call out specific individuals, but if you did want to share a memory or experience in the chat, feel free to do so. So here are some representative student comments from my anonymous evaluations that, caught my attention. My motivation was solely focused on making good grades on his exams, which required too much chemistry, neuroanatomy, and memorization of drug names. The exams were extremely hard, with so much information to remember. You should do weekly quizzes or some other class activity rather than just requiring these long, hard exams. This was a tough class to keep motivation up in. All lecture and way too dependent on PowerPoint slides. He went through the presentations too fast and taught the course like it was a PhD course. So what motivated me to change and adopt inclusive teaching practices? I think that this is an important thing, and a lot of people like me, need to be sort of reached out to at a certain level. And for me as a scientist, seeing my own data helped. And this is something I've seen some resistance to, but putting the data out there, sharing the data, analyzing the data, it's very impactful for someone like me at least. So in addition to these negative student comments, I sought out and was given, data on equity gaps in my classes and found the negative results to be jarring. I also consulted with several learning centers. I think that these are very important. Highly, I implore everyone to seek out learning centers and consult with, various educational designers as well, whose members directed me to high quality books and resources. By reviewing these, I realized that inclusive teaching wasn't what I assumed it to be. There was a time that I was a little, I had some animosity to the idea. So I initially thought that inclusive teaching required hand-holding, was less rigorous, and encouraged the omission of sensitive content, which I was very against. By educating myself on the topic and reading many books and articles, I learned that the opposite is true if implemented correctly. Inclusive pedagogy is really about the teaching structures and methods used in the classroom that allow all student voices to be part of the conversation, and in turn, all students learn more together. Using this approach, they get to learn from a diversity of sources, including each other, not just the textbook or me. As a result, I think my courses have actually become more challenging and rigorous as I have adopted inclusive teaching approaches. Rather than just memorizing what's in my mind, my students now have to grapple with real-world implications and their peers' perspectives, in addition to other cognitive resources I bring in, related to the content, and develop important competencies like civil discourse and conveying their conclusions in various formats and styles. I also considered the hundreds of college classes that I've taken and concluded that in the most memorable ones, I learned as much from my peers as I did from the professor. If you think about it, you might come to the same conclusion. So, considering a panoply of diverse viewpoints rather than a single source is more likely to trigger deep thinking and produce a memorable learning experience. So now let's get to some of these data that speak so much to me. As a biomedical scientist, nothing is really more validating than objective data and a good graph. So I wanted to share one with you. Here you can see my drop withdrawal failing data from the class I teach most commonly, drugs, brain, and behavior. You're currently looking at the results of my first 4 years teaching. The green bar represents students that do not identify as an underrepresented minority. The orange bars represent students who do. As you can see, my teacher-centric high-stakes exam approach that I was using early on, and I think is very common still in certain disciplines, produced a noticeable equity gap. Not only is there a noticeable equity gap, if 20 to 25% of your students are, failing or dropping or withdrawing, I think you're going to have a problem, and you're contributing to possibly negative retention of students at the institution in general. I then began to gradually bake in learner-centric inclusive pedagogy into my classes and observed an apparent change in student outcomes. I still want to make considerable changes to my courses. This is a long sort of evolutionary process that includes adaptability and flexibility year to year, that growth mindset. Uh, but I'm proud that I've eliminated equity gaps. And I also want to point out that overall, this approach, inclusive pedagogy, works for all students. Not only am I eliminating equity gaps, I'm improving overall the amount of students that make it through my course without dropping, failing, or withdrawing. And this isn't just me. Here you can see the results of a meta-analysis of 228 studies. The researchers found that the classes that embraced comparable active learning and inclusive approaches significantly increased pass rates when compared to traditional lecture-based courses. So I've worked hard to find effective strategies to eliminate all equity gaps in my courses and reduce overall drop withdrawal failing rates. My continually evolving approach is based on teaching and training and utilizes evidence-based techniques. This isn't just something that, again, I'm an objective critical scientist. I am not just randomly picking and choosing these things. Everything that I have adopted is evidence-based and typically comes within the science of learning. In addition to working with several teaching centers, I've also earned my certificate in effective college instruction from the Association of College and University Educators. This intensive training experience taught me how to design approachable assignments, foster belonging and inclusive discourse, and create an accommodating classroom environment using the concepts of universal design. I also began thinking about pedagogy scientifically. Each semester, I consider which variables and assignments I can tweak to improve my students' outcomes and student satisfaction data. My current goal for each course is now to provide a learner-centric classroom experience that is inclusive, thought-provoking, and competency building. And I will argue again and throughout here that this is not less rigorous. It's not coming at the expense of rigor. If anything, I'll argue quite the opposite is happening. In response to recent developments in the science of teaching and learning, I've converted from using this sort of teacher-centric classroom model to a learner-centric one. Instead of exclusively lecturing, I now provide refined chunked lectures and spend almost 50 to 60% of the class time on student learning activities. This approach is particularly well suited for the asynchronous online learning environment. As many of you remember, we all got to try out teaching online during the COVID pandemic. This experience showed us that if you simply push a lecture-heavy course online, students become disconnected, disengaged, and crave community. This is not effective pedagogy. So, in particular, I began carefully considering how to engage students and create a community for my asynchronous online students. Giving up the power and the spotlight of being the sage on the stage, it's a little uneasy at first. But I began to notice that this learner-centric instructional approach provided outcomes that I value, and I bet you value too. I noticed that students felt more empowered, particularly when they have some level of choice or agency. I noticed that rather than simply regurgitating what I told them to memorize, students were much more likely to relate the content to prior learning in addition to their own and their peers' lived experiences. I noticed that students were developing stronger competencies, including critical thinking, civil discourse, various styles of effective writing, and oral communication skills. And I noticed that students bought in more and were more likely to take charge of their learning experience. I also want to devote some time to one issue I grappled with during my transition, giving up my precious lecture time. It isn't easy to let go of the lengthy lecture and the spotlight that comes with it. Not only is being the sage on the stage incredibly gratifying, but many of our colleagues and students sometimes judge us negatively for not prioritizing it. I also had many comments or questions about, well, how do you possibly still fit in all the content I need in this physiology course or this anatomy course? I promise you can. And there's a lot of redundancy and various ways that you can trim to fit in some of these learning activities. So creating the most effective and efficient lectures possible, effective learning activities, and organizing peer communities also requires a lot of time and effort. This is not easy. It does require some work. And it arguably will require a lot more work and time than throwing together a PowerPoint presentation like this one. But it's also important. I mean, there's science that suggests why you should make this transition. For one, the metacognition literature suggests that lectures can be ineffective, particularly very long 90-minute ones, especially when you are lecturing to students who are novices in a specific content area. In addition to the attentional and cognitive load constraints of the brain, it is worth considering that experts' brains differ from novice brains. This isn't to say that experts are more intelligent. Rather, they simply have greater brain connections involving a specific content area. When I was mainly just a neuroscientist, I didn't know much about the science of teaching and learning. It took me some time before I could make the connections of what people were talking about at conferences like this one. And also within a specific area of knowledge, novice brains lack these rich networked connections and have a limited capacity to make inferences. This is technically synaptic plasticity. This point is illustrated in the cartoon that you can see here. You can see two people. The one on the left is a novice, and the one on the right is an expert in the content area that you are lecturing on. Both receive the same amount of information symbolized by the dots. However, the content expert can easily make inferences and associations involving the content, whereas a novice can't. On the contrary, when anyone is introduced to a new subject area, They have an existing knowledge base and lived experiences. It may distract them or even produce cognitive dissonance. This mental conflict is often worth exploring, even though it can make one uncomfortable, which is something that can occur if you then allow these unique students to reflect on the material together through social learning in an organized community. Novices also lack the expert's ability to perform automatically or habitually within the comfort of their expertise. For example, if you watch Stevie Wonder play the piano or Tiger Woods play golf, you might think that these learned skills look easy and that anyone could do it. I don't know about you, but the few times I've tried or to do either of these activities, I quickly became overloaded and frustrated and gave up. So now I'm going to show you some examples of the learning activities I'm beginning to introduce in my student-centered classes. I will start by describing several iterations of my deep thought discussions, which I orient around various source materials or cognitive inputs other than just me and my thoughts. Importantly, I want to emphasize that I select sources that personify a diversity of backgrounds and viewpoints. For example, and we do very much get into sensitive topics, but some of these include, for example, when we consider the neuroendocrinology or the hormonal and neural bases of gender identity in my classes. We consider the perspectives of Doctors Ben Barres and Dr. Carissa Tsan-Bonmatsu, two transgender scientists, Erik Kandel, a Nobel-winning neuroscientist, Robert Sapolsky, a notoriously smooth-tongued endocrinologist that can tell a great story, Frans de Waal, a primatologist who describes gender outside of the context of human society, and Carol Hooven, who, within some controversy or amidst controversy, left her position at Harvard over criticism she received from transgender allies on her work involving testosterone. After considering these sometimes contradictory viewpoints, rather than simply regurgitating their messages, my students must discuss their takeaway conclusions with their peers, which also brings in their own and their peers' lived experiences. I'll first use my drugs, brain, and behavior class as an example. This is typically a 15-week course that I've set up around 15 individual modules. Although I've also developed it as a condensed 8-week version, again, without sacrificing any content, we just condense those modules. Each module contains a concise, chunked lecture component and a quiz, in addition to a deep thought discussion. For these, students must review the content I provide them and then, in response to a prompt, create a thought paragraph that they share with a discussion thread. To earn full credit for their discussion paragraph, they must also reply to a set number of peers' posts. And I emphasize that replies may also be recurring exchanges with one or two peers to encourage back and forth discussion. There are many different ways to do this as well. I mean, Discord servers are great. I've experimented with Flipgrid and some of these video apps as well. There are many ways to really get at that sort of social exchange. Here you can see a snapshot from a page of my syllabus that describes what to do during our first module. The students must review chunked recordings of my lectures and then take a quiz to evaluate their understanding of the content knowledge. They then must review curated material that was selected to promote deep thinking and rich discussion. In this case, they must read an 11-page research article by neuropharmacologist David Nutt, who argues that alcohol is more harmful than cannabis, LSD, or even heroin. They then must watch a 10-minute video describing how Dr. Nutt was sacked or fired from his position as the UK government's sort of drug czar as a result of his viewpoint. In addition, they must critically consider his new alcohol alternative, Sensuous Spirits, which you've probably encountered yourselves through various advertisements and in the news. And they also must review the Controlled Substance Act, which describes how drugs are scheduled as class 1 through 5 in the United States. They are then asked to respond to one of the following prompts and discuss their thoughts with their peers. Is alcohol more dangerous than any of the following: heroin, morphine, cocaine, methamphetamine, amphetamine, MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, or cannabis? And, if Dr. Nutt owns Sensuous Spirits, is he a scientist who is simply practicing what he preaches, or do you also see a conflict of interest at this point in time? In general, really throughout a lot of these, I also try to bring in ethical considerations and, be as critical of the source material as possible for simply to promote deep and critical thinking. Now I want to show you how I set up my deep thought discussions in my behavioral neuroscience class, in which I take a very different, oh, no, sorry. Here's some additional prompts that I use in my drugs, brain, and behavior class. Do adolescents who are subconsciously experiencing psychiatric symptoms seek out mind-altering drugs to self-medicate? Or does experimentation generally increase the risk of developing schizophrenia in susceptible individuals? Almost all psychiatric drugs and drug dosing were designed around Caucasian men. We obviously should be, so why aren't we better at personalizing drug prescriptions to the individual? How can we develop better pharmacotherapies for various ethnicities, women, or transgender people? Would a drug produce the same effects in a cisgender man and a transgender woman with proper hormone therapy in place? And could cycles or shifts in hormones influence absorption or the interaction between drugs and the body? In addition, I'll also point out here that AI and games, I think, are a direction that I'm going to involve in this a lot more. While I think AI has a lot of powerful applications in learning, including in the research process, I have some of my students develop AI podcasts, for example, with curated articles that they find and then share the podcast with their peers and reflect on how it compares with their source material. But I find that one of the most powerful applications of AI might be in running some of these simulations. You can run simulations in how things might be different under, one case or the other. If some variable historically has changed regarding drug development, how things might have played out. And this also allows people to explore bias and learn about not only how things might be if things you took a different path or played with a variable a little bit, but this also sort of helps teach how things are and were. So now I also want to show you how I set up my deep thought discussions in my behavioral neuroscience course, a completely different class here. And I take many different approaches to implementing some of these deep thought discussions and critical thinking exercises, learning activities. In behavioral neuroscience, I am currently arranging a lot of my learning activities around different books. So here are just two of the books that I'm using. I am next would like to actually include more books and allow them to sort of create learning communities within several around several of these books rather than just requiring everybody to read two and participate in discussions about it. That, of course, requires some amount of work, but it I think is worth it, and also would be ideal to have the students have some agency and choice in which books exactly they're reading. But my point of showing you this is really to emphasize that learning activities can be structured around many different course formats and source materials. It doesn't just have to be about research articles or TED Talks or books. There are many ways to get at this. So here, around these books, In each module, in addition to reviewing my chunk lectures and taking a quiz, which again would be lower stakes than these sort of big exams that you might give 2 or 3 times over the course of a semester. Students must complete a study guide on their readings from one book that I give called The Disordered Mind by Nobel laureate Eric Kandel, and create a discussion post on their readings from the book called Determined, which really explores, is there free will? Does the brain play a role in this? What are the implications if we assume or determine that some concepts of free will come from the brain and are due to things like experience? What are the implications for the criminal justice system? How might neuroscience inform the criminal justice system rather than just traditional, old, well, common approaches, including moral philosophy. Uh, but anyway, here is one representative prompt. If genes and experience program your brain to determine your actions, what implications might this have for your conception of moral responsibility in criminal justice? In addition, students must choose one topic of interest from either book to further research and submit several scaffolded continuation activities, including an annotated bibliography, a reflection on an AI-generated podcast that they must create using their research sources, and an original essay. And then with that AI podcast, I also have them critically consider how it compares to the actual source material and reflect on how it might aid or make the research process more efficient. I mean, how can they ethically harness AI in their future with the idea of developing useful competencies? And I'll also just briefly compare and contrast these two books that I've chosen. One definitely determined gets it a lot more of application, deep picture, big thinking ideas like criminal justice and neuroscience. Whereas the other book, Disordered Mind by Kandel, it's a lot more, um, based on content. There's a lot more sort of learning the fundamentals of neuroscience, where and the history of neuroscience as a field. So you're really getting at different aspects of content and learning in general. So which I would actually argue adds a whole other level or degree of rigor than they would get when they only were listening to my PowerPoint presentations and my lecture notes from my memory. As my final deep thought discussion example, I'll show you how I set up my hormones and behavior course, the third course that I'm concurrently teaching right now, which is basically a hybrid of the two approaches I just described. Again, there are many different ways and forms that this can take. In this class, students are assigned one book to discuss, but also spend time devoted to specific hot button issues, including what is the pill and how might it influence behavior? How does neuroendocrinology impact gender identity? And how do the sex hormones influence athletic performance? You might have heard about someone talking about that in the news recently. A few people seem to care. So here I select learning activities that include the students preparing a book review for multiple audiences based on the book that they're reading here, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And they also create a policy memo for the International Olympic Committee on Fair and Athletic Participation. I even encourage them to actually mail it to them, if they feel so inclined, although their grade isn't required or impacted by them doing so. For this policy memo, I intentionally framed the value of the assignment. Specifically, I state that this is a significant question our society is struggling with. This assignment intends to help them learn to express a cogent argument as a policy statement and grapple with the nuance of this topic. I also reiterate that I am not there to police their thoughts, and I'm not looking for a right answer. And I think this is very important. Several of my students, are a little uneasy about this at first. They think that I'm, trying to indoctrinate them with some opinion, and that couldn't be more wrong. That's certainly not my intent at all. And because understandably they are concerned about their grade, I specifically clarify that their opinion, their viewpoint will not impact their grade whatsoever. Their grade is not based on their position or opinion. All viewpoints and perspectives can earn an A if clearly stated and well defended using science. As for the specific instructions, they are told to review 3 articles I assigned them and then to perform their own independent research before using this information to create a policy statement that addresses the fairness of athletic participation on the basis of gender identity and sex variation. And their statement must be supported using their knowledge of behavioral endocrinology. I also have an AI step in there where they using the article that they found that supports their viewpoint and position. They must create an AI podcast using Google Notebook LM and then share this podcast with their peers, including an analysis of how the podcast compares to the source material. Again, how this exercise could be used in their future with the idea of developing ethical AI competencies, and also just a general summary of the AI podcast, which I also think is sort of a good jumping off point that allows them to discuss this important topic. So I clearly include some hot button sensitive topics in my courses. While I know some colleagues will shy away from these, and some have told me that I should, I think it is very important to confront and deeply consider the most timely and relevant topics of our times, especially when they are directly related to the course at hand. To facilitate civil discourse around these topics, I recommend co-creating discussion norms or a community agreement with your class before you delve in to such sensitive discussions. For example, here are the community discussion norms for my current hormones class. Challenge ideas you disagree with through reason and debate rather than avoidance or suppression. Challenge the idea, not the person. Learning to lean into difficult conversations and be willing to consider diverse perspectives and viewpoints. Acknowledge that we come from different backgrounds and bring unique perspectives. Do not make assumptions about other students' identities based on their contents. And acknowledge where you agree with your critics and what you've learned from them. When describing sexual and gender minoritized populations in this course, please reference this guide. Now, I add this last part here because since I published my course at the beginning, just, a couple of months ago, the NIH guide that I was using went down. This is now a dead link. So again, I had to pivot here. This is, I think a unique case, but at the same time, not so unique. Oftentimes you have to pivot and roll with the punches with these online classes, especially with someone like me that uses a lot of different links and resources. It's not that uncommon that a link goes down, even though the circumstances of this one going down in particular are a bit, different. But, what I did here in this case was I replaced the link through an announcement with an alternative link. The replacement link brings up also an important issue that has impacted students in my class, and I think that this is worth bringing up. So I included this NPR guide, and there are many like it, and it's not exhaustive. But one point that the NPR guide brings up that the NIH guide did not is that even critiques itself a little bit. So again, something that I like to bring into a lot of these assignments. And it critiques itself by pointing out that really a lot of its concepts and vocabulary around gender and sexual identity is Western and US centric. Other cultures may use different labels and have other concepts of gender. Notably, and I think that this is important, although I will also, this is one point that I've had some sort of heated conversations about with other faculty that some people have strong opinions about, but I've adopted a syllabus policy stating that any student may opt out of any discussion if it causes trauma or significant discomfort. This doesn't mean they get a free pass. What happens here is we do create an alternative assignment for them, but I think that this is important for to create a safe space for the students. One observation that I wanted to share with you that has taught me a lot about how diverse my students are, both in their identities and viewpoints, and has led me to think about this concept more broadly. So, especially in regard to this assignment, I thought that opt-out policy would lead to some of my many valued transgender students requesting to opt out because they don't feel comfortable discussing this with their peers. It actually is, it's been the opposite. I've actually, I have received several requests from my students to opt out of discussions related to the neuroendocrinological basis of gender identity and a little less with the athletic participation part. But yeah, especially when we start talking about the neuroendocrine basis of gender identity, I have had students opt out, but surprisingly, this has not been any of my transgender students. While I really created this policy, with them in mind, to date, 100% of the requests that I've had to opt out have come from international, non-US citizens from a variety of different cultures, backgrounds, belief structures, and identities. This observation was very illuminating to me and made it clear to me that there are many reasons why a student might not feel comfortable in expressing their viewpoints about a specific topic with their peers, and I need to make space for that. While I don't really have a perfect solution to this issue, I've experienced three levels of resolution that I'll share. First, I explain to the concerned student that all viewpoints and cultures and backgrounds are welcome in this space. I'm not here to push an agenda. I'm here to create a venue, a forum where these topics can be discussed from all perspectives. And they may share their opinions while as long as they're mindful of others and are using inclusive language. Some students that will at this point come back and participate in the discussions, but not all. For those who are still reluctant to participate, I give them the option to discuss the material with me privately in a Zoom room so we can still engage in the critical thinking around the topic, even though we're taking away some of the social learning aspect, which is unfortunate. But after doing so, I found that some of the students will even go back and join the social learning community. However, I've still had students that just don't want to do that at all. They don't want to talk to me about this topic either. So when uh, find the student that's just very uncomfortable, I still want to create this safe space for them. And I create an alternative assignment for them that we can then discuss and think critically about together. This, I've made a variety of alternative assignments where they can still earn full credit. Navigating a variety of cultures, belief systems, and identities can be a difficult and complex issue, and it doesn't always play out the way you might expect. And while I don't have a perfect solution, my experience has informed me that culture and religion and identity are, complicated and multifaceted, and need to be thought of very broadly. And that wasn't exactly how I was initially thinking about diversity and inclusion, and arguably I wasn't thinking about these concepts broadly enough. But there are many different political viewpoints and backgrounds and cultures that need to be included as well. Oops. So you may be curious about my assignment weights. So here I am using my hormones class as an example. So when I was a centered instructor, 100% of their final grade came from high stakes exams. I've also played around with the idea of just one midterm and a final. But that was old me. Now, as a more learner-centric instructor, approximately one-third of their grade is based on their grasp of my content knowledge, and they are tested using 14 lower stakes quizzes rather than 3 or 4 large exams. Another one-third of their grade is based on the quality of their deep thinking discussion posts, which are, again, bringing in a lot of social learning. And the remaining one-third of their grade is based on the continuation activities, including reflection of an AI-generated podcast they created using their own source material, a book review, and the Olympic policy memo. I also want to acknowledge that my chunked lectures and deep thinking assignments are far from perfect. A good teaching approach is constantly evolving and improving. I know that I need to improve the quality and accessibility of my lecture recordings. I also want to increase choice in both my source materials and assignments. For example, rather than assigning one book to the entire class like I do in both behavioral neuroscience and hormones, I would like to give them a choice between 3 books and have them self-select into learning communities where they engage with the material in more intimate groups. It takes me more time and effort to create a brief chunked lecture than a 90-minute PowerPoint presentation, and it takes considerable time to set up learning activities around one book, let alone 3 per class. Nevertheless, I've created a peer learning community-based assignment in my drugs class I would now like to share you as my finale. But first, why do I want to center my course material and assignments around small learning communities? My reasoning is perfectly summarized in this published model, which seems to work particularly well in the context of asynchronous online classes. The 3 elements of the model are cognitive presence, teacher presence, and social presence. Teacher presence might be the easiest to comprehend. This refers to what I am doing as the instructor. Am I present in the discussion boards? Am I interacting with the students? Cognitive presence is something I've already alluded to a bit. It refers to the source materials, activities, themes, and prompts you select as the foundation of student learning. Social presence is the students interacting and learning from each other. This is what's most easily lost in the online class. So we must strive to design our asynchronous online courses to encourage the social aspect and to ensure that students feel comfortable sharing their thoughts. And we must do so intentionally. Community building should be emphasized, not just for the sense of togetherness it provides, but because it also helps keep students in the class, promotes full engagement in class activities, facilitates effective collaborative learning, and encourages continued communication after the course or program is complete. The development of community should be an intentional goal when designing class activities. So now I'll share one choice-based learning community activity I've created for my drugs, brain, and behavior class. It's very similar to our icebreaker. In this media club assignment, students choose whether they want to consider drugs within the context of a book, a series of movies, or a series of music mixtapes that I've created. They then join a learning community where they discuss their thoughts with like-minded peers over the remainder of the term as, again, another level of social learning. They're given a list of movies, book chapters, or mixed tapes that they can access online, instructed to make a series of discussion posts and to respond to their peers. In addition, they are instructed to develop an idea that grabs their attention into a critical thinking paper. This student and I discuss their idea at midterm through an outline submission where I give them feedback. Some representative topics that have come up include, the effect of substance abuse on family structures and dynamics, a fictional story of the life of a rock star who goes from poverty to being a celebrity on drugs, psychedelics as psychiatric drugs, whether cannabis is causing harm, whether cannabis is a plant-based medicine that should be legal, U.S. drug policies and drug war inequitably impact minoritized populations. And here we specifically get into some of the indigenous populations. whether indigenous medicine might be more beneficial as a psychiatric medicine, particularly when it's introduced in a spiritual context. So, lots of different avenues of thought that this is inspired. Here's just a snapshot of the syllabus, just of one little snippet of some of the movies and book chapters and mixtapes of how that would be set up or organized. Now I want to conclude by showing you some of the student comments that stood out to me and support the notion of online students crave community. These come from a campus-wide survey that my school conducted during the middle of the COVID pandemic. Building a few supportive relationships with my classmates is critical because as an online student, it would be easy to miss the camaraderie that often exists in a traditional classroom. That same camaraderie online motivates and keeps me engaged in the class. Having strong relationships with my classmates is an important support system. They can totally relate to my experience. Plus, it gives me more well-rounded and diverse experience. If you learn online in your own bubble, you risk missing out on what your classmates can share with you. My first semester, I didn't talk to anyone outside of class, and the work just seemed like work. It was interesting, but it just didn't mean as much when I finally made significant connections as with the classmates. Once I made that connection, I started to make others, and I realized what a difference it made, helping me feel more like I was part of a community. So, in conclusion, I've come to realize that inclusive teaching is a mindset and more related to style than substance. It's not synonymous with introducing diversity issues or telling students what they should think about them. It's certainly not indoctrination. Rather, it is about offering diverse voices and viewpoints and fostering student-led civil discourse around them. Inclusive teaching is about not about hand-holding or making classes easier. It is about providing structure that will help students think deeply and critically and teaching important skills and competencies that they can use in future to get endeavors. I know that by slightly tweaking my classes and embracing inclusive pedagogy, I eliminated equity gaps in my classes and overall reduced drop withdrawal failing rates for all students. This approach works for everybody. And importantly, I contend that introducing these inclusive practices did not occur at the expense of rigor. I'm happy to debate this with anybody. If anything, I believe my classes now require more critical thinking, competency development, and grappling with timely, relevant, real-world issues than they did when I was exclusively prioritizing memorizing mechanisms and drug names and anatomy. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. If you can also feel free to email me uh, any questions, comments, or concerns.
Hi, Eric. I think we have time for like one or two questions, and one came up in the chat early at the beginning of your presentation. I think you may have gotten to this with one of the recent slides, but I think one of our participants is wondering what your students have said in end of the course evaluations. Like, does it reflect the data and then that general institutional information that you presented a slide or two ago?
Yes, I've since I've been implementing these sort of more learning activities and social community learning groups. I have received overwhelmingly positive responses in the qualitative parts of my evaluations. You know, oftentimes students point out that this is the type of online class that they would like or would continue seeking out. That the community, the social connection made them feel a lot less isolated. Some of my students are primarily online, and they point out that that isn't something that they always get, and that's something that they crave. The building of the community in particular. So yes, I would say very positive feedback on the online in the anonymous surveys, particularly centered around the community building. You know, the students, the online students crave community, and yes, these learning communities are a great way to go in building also that social learning component.
Thank you. Stacy, I am going to have to save your question for later because I'm the moderator on a 10 o'clock session. But I encourage you to take down Eric's email and maybe exchange that way. It's just a question about recommendations for courses that aren't reading based. But I'm going to go ahead and close out this session so that I can open it up for the next presenter. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.